Day. Today, 10th January, we can say, in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, that even though President Putin, who is, by the way, on a visit to the far eastern region of Chukotka in Russia, even though President Putin did not announce a Christmas truce this year, nonetheless, there has been what one might call a Christmas lull in the ground fighting. It does seem as if Russian offensive operations have slackened somewhat in all of the main areas of the battlefronts, in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, in the Marinka area, in Kupiansk, in Zaporozhye region. Slackened, but not stopped entirely. There were reports, for example, that a major battle was underway in the area of the Popova forest, somewhere to the west of the village of Khromovo that the Russians captured a few weeks ago in the Bakhmut area. The Popova forest is said to be important for the Russians to capture in order to collapse Ukrainian defenses to the west of Bakhmut as they move forward or press forward towards the canal west of Chasiv Yar and conceivably towards Chasiv Yar itself. And there are also considerable reports of very intense fighting going on in the northwestern areas of northwest of Avdiivka. Along the railway line, the Russians continue to push north up the railway line, and the major encounter battles that are happening around Stepovoye and Berdichi continue without slackening. Slavyangrad, about a day ago, published a very interesting report from a Russian reporter who has been traveling on the front lines. This person seems to have been particularly acquainted with the military situation in the Rabotino Verbovoye area. He said that this area between Rabotino and Verbovoye, this salient that the Ukrainians carved out for themselves over the course of the summer offensive, has in effect become a kind of cauldron. In fact, the Slavyangrad reproduction of his report, in fact, spoke of it being a cauldron. It said that the communication lines to this, to the troops, the Ukrainian troops, holding or trying to hold their positions within this salient, allegedly 2 brigades worth of troops, have now become very tenuous indeed. The Russians are able to bombard and intercept the road from Orekhov, which is the main Ukrainian supply base in the area, and the position of the Ukrainian troops in this area is extremely bad. That probably is true, but I think it is premature to refer to it as a cauldron. Certainly the Russians continue to exert pressure in this area, as they are incrementally doing all along the front lines. Now, in the far north, in Kupiansk, in the area of Kupiansk, the place closest to the place where, in a sense, Russian offensive operations kicked off in the late summer and autumn, and where the Russians have basically reached the village of Sinkovka, have not made sporadic attempts to enter it, but have never fully captured it. Anyway, reports have been circulating for several days, as I reported in recent videos, that a major Russian offensive will be launched sometime around the 15th of January. Now, I don't know to what extent these reports are true. I think anybody really does. As I said in a recent program, anybody who tries to second guess Russian actions and Russian intentions, is setting themselves up for a fall. The Russians have shown great ability to move forces, to move their pressure points from one part of the front lines to another as they cumulatively increase the pressure on all of the front lines. But anyway, clearly someone in Ukraine is very concerned about the situation in Kupiansk because three of the most important people in Ukraine's military, General Zaluzhny, the commander of the ground forces and the chief of overall commander of military forces, in fact, and the chief of general staff of Ukraine, Rustem Umarov, the defense minister, and General Syrskyi all came together in the Kupiansk area, and there's pictures of them conducting a conference with each other. Now, the usual claims were made that these three men came together and agreed that the Russian advance on Kupiansk has been contained, that the Ukrainians are controlling Sinkovka, obviously an attempt to give an optimistic spin in connection with this meeting, but one doesn't hold a meeting like this on the front lines unless one is either concerned about something or planning something. And my sense is that probably this meeting is concerned with these worries that sometime around the 15th of January or perhaps thereafter, the Russians are indeed going to launch some big offensive in the Kupiansk-Kharkiv area. As I said, we shall see. But anyway, the fact that these three important people were there, as I said, speaks of some concerns on the Ukrainian side about what might come in this part of the battlefronts. Though one must also perhaps take into account the possibility that Zaluzhny, Umerov, and Syrskyi were also debating what further steps Ukraine itself might take in terms of attacks on the Russian towns of Belgorod and Bryansk just across the border. As to those attacks, they do continue. Ukraine continues to launch various attacks on these two border towns. But my sense is that though from time to time damage is done and people unfortunately get killed, nonetheless, overall, the Russians have brought the situation there very much under control. These attacks have become increasingly less effective, and the attempts to launch missiles, or rather rockets, with Czech multiple launch rocket systems, they appear to have been largely unsuccessful. The Russians seem to be able to shoot most of these rockets down, and also increasing numbers of the drones that Ukraine has been trying to launch against these two towns. But perhaps the Ukrainians are planning something more ambitious, and this is what has brought together these three people in this area. I think this is unlikely myself. I would have thought that if things were going well in this area, they could have had a meeting in Kiev to discuss things. It's also perhaps worth pointing out that historically, relations between Zaluzhny and Syrskyi, two of the participants in this meeting, have not been especially good. It seems to me that probably a better explanation is that Zaluzhny and Umerov, who do seem to work fairly well together, came to this area to find out what Syrskyi was up to in advance of what they all fear will be a Russian attack after the 15th of January in precisely this area. Anyway, enough of that. Now, why we do get, as we always do, discordant reports about what is going on in the fighting in particular places. So yesterday, there was an accumulation of reports from Russian sources, principally Russian sources, which said that the Russians had actually pulled back troops from the village of Novomykhailivka, south of Marinka, that the Russians found the going in Novomykhailivka harder than they expected, that they're in the process of regrouping their forces, and that they seem to be launching attacks to the north of Novomykhailivka and to the west of Novomykhailivka as they tried to take this village in a semicircle, and that for the moment at least, the operation to storm Novomykhailivka has been called off. Now that may be completely true, but I would say that our old friend Yan Gagin, the advisor of Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, Donetsk, of course, the Donetsk region now formally being a part of the Russian Federation, at least as far as the Russians are concerned. Anyway, Yan Gagin has something rather different to say. He's given an interview, from what I understand, to TASS, the official Russian news agency, and he says this: near Novomykhailivka, the adversary, that means the Ukrainians, fled from two areas at once, leaving behind only those who were critically wounded and the bodies of their dead colleagues. Several positions were also abandoned near Georgievka. This is a village to the west of Marinka. Novomykhailivka is to the south of Marinka. Georgievka is to the west of Marinka. And then TASS tells us that Gagin clarified that several units of light arms of various calibers had been found in one of the abandoned Ukrainian strongholds. And then Gagin goes on to tell us that Ukrainian troops have decreased the use of artillery several-fold and increased drone strikes in order to save shells. Well, we know that from many, many sources. And TASS also says that Vadim Astafyev, spokesman for Russia's Yug battle group, told TASS yesterday that Russian forces had improved their tactical position near Georgievka and Bogdanovka. Bogdanovka, of course, the village near Bakhmut. So the Russians supposedly are advancing in Georgievka. They're advancing around Bogdanovka. And according to Yan Gagin, possibly contradicting those reports from yesterday, they are improving their positions around Novomykhailivka just after we've had other reports from Telegram channels and people of that nature telling us that the Russians have actually pulled their troops back from Novomykhailivka. My guess about what's going on in Novomykhailivka is that this is another very complex encounter battle. The Russians clearly do intend eventually to bring Novomykhailivka under their control. This is an important village, however, in strategic terms. The Ukrainians feel that they need to control this village in order to keep their positions in this part of Donbass at least viable. And it's quite likely that the Ukrainians have counterattacked, and it's quite likely that the Russians withdrew. The Russians have always shown a willingness to withdraw forces and to conserve troops. They are not really in the business of trying to hold every millimeter of ground that they capture. So probably an encounter battle of some kind is underway. My guess is that there was some kind of a Ukrainian counterattack over the previous couple of days. The Russians perhaps today, Gagin's interview with TASS was made today. Maybe Gagin is reporting what has now happened subsequent to that counterattack. Maybe the Russians have retaken control of some positions. Maybe they've pushed the Ukrainians back and have captured other positions. Or maybe just Gagin is making this all up because he wants to avoid admitting that the Russians have actually pulled back in Novomykhailivka. Though I have to say, I think the latter is very unlikely. Anyway, a battle going on in Novomykhailivka, as we see in many other places. But overall, coming back to my initial point, my sense is that there is something of a Christmas lull, which is unsurprising. There's been intense fighting going on right across the front lines. The whole of 2023, basically without pause, the Russians went on the attack during the period of the Rasputitsa, when most people were expecting the fighting to slacken off, and Christmas has come, and it's quite likely that the Russian High Command, even if they were not prepared to authorize an actual Christmas truce, nonetheless understood that the men needed some more time to rest and relax before the fighting resumes in earnest, probably next week. So that's what I would say about all of this. And to return again to the topic of that big meeting in the Kupiansk area, the fact that Zaluzhny, Umerov, and Syrsky have come together and are talking with each other in the Kupiansk area, suggests that the Ukrainians, at least it suggests to me, that the Ukrainians are worried about the future of the situation there. So that's basically the situation on the front lines. Accumulating Russian pressure. This has been the story since October. It is important to stress, I made this point many times, that apart from Avdiivka, where I think the Russians really are conducting an offensive and do really intend at some point to capture that town, and General Zaluzhny has admitted that eventually they will, it is important to stress again that there is no general Russian offensive. I discussed yesterday what the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, had to say about the situation. He went before the Russian Defense Ministry Board. He at no point spoke about an offensive. No Russian official has spoken about the Russian troops being engaged in an offensive. And going back to what Shoigu said, he said that Russian groups of forces are methodically reducing the combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine. We retain the strategic initiative along the entire line of contact. And he spoke, again, as I said in my video yesterday, about the depletion of the human resources of Ukrainian formations. And this policy of aggressive attrition remains, for the moment at least, the Russian policy. Now, we've had some more reports over the last 24 hours that appear to confirm the massive toll that this policy of aggressive attrition, this strategy of aggressive attrition is taking, the Russians are following, is taking, the immense damage it is causing Ukraine. Now, firstly, Ukraine's former Procurator General, Attorney General, Yuri Lutsenko, an individual that might be most familiar to Americans because of the role he played in the first Trump impeachment. Anyway, Lutsenko has now come forward and he has said that total Ukrainian losses are 500,000 men dead and severely wounded. Now, let me say again, that's Lutsenko's claim. Lutsenko is not a current member of the Ukrainian government. I'm not sure where Lutsenko is obtaining this information. Maybe he's just guessing. Maybe he's taking it from the internet. Maybe he's had talks with various people who have informed him about this. We don't know how authoritative these people are. But Lutsenko is a prominent person in Ukraine, and certainly he's in a better position to know than most others who have commented about this matter are. One must, however, add a further word of caution. I think it is now universally accepted by pretty much everyone that there is a major power conflict underway in Kiev. Zelensky and Zaluzhny, for the moment at least, do not seem to be on speaking terms. There's lots of talk about various factions maneuvering for position in Kiev. It is not impossible that Lutsenko has come up with this figure of 500,000 severely dead or severely wounded in order to damage Zelensky, that he might be one of those people who is now maneuvering against Zelensky, perhaps in association with various others. Anyway, that was Lutsenko. I think that one can place certain amount of weight in the figure that he has given, which, by the way, does accord fairly closely with other guesstimates of total Ukrainian losses over the course of this fighting. Defense Minister Shoigu, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu, put Ukrainian losses at in excess of 215,000 over the course of 2023, dead and wounded. So if we add all the losses from 2022 and perhaps the losses that Ukraine has suffered in the first week of this year, maybe 500,000 dead and wounded is roughly right. But anyway, as I said, I would place a certain amount of weight on it, but I don't consider it to be in any way a conclusive number. Just saying. Against that, and however perhaps more usefully, we've had a really alarming article from the Wall Street Journal. And it says that Ukraine's war effort is stuck. This heroic battlefield failure shows why. The heroic battlefield failure was the disastrous defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive. And the article then goes on to tell us that the best Ukrainian forces were severely defeated during the offensive, and that the Ukrainians have lost all their best men, either dead or wounded. And there are very similar reports coming from various people in Germany as well. One of the German officers who seems to be involved in training Ukrainian troops has come forward and has said that all of the best trained men, the junior officers, the NCOs, the best trained soldiers with whom Ukraine started the war in 2022 are now either dead or severely wounded, and that in effect the Ukrainian army today is no longer the force it was when the war began. So we see various Western sources now corroborating again the reports of severe damage done to the Ukrainian forces, to the Ukrainian military, And we see the cumulative effect of this Russian strategy of aggressive attrition. Now, the Russians have been keeping a careful eye on Ukraine's plan to mobilize more troops. The latest mobilization plan. Shoigu mentioned it in his recent roundup to the defense people, the one I've just quoted from. He said that this mobilization will simply prolong the war. It won't change the course of the fighting, and it certainly won't change the realities on the line of contact. And there's been an article about the Ukrainian mobilization, the planned Ukrainian mobilization, in the Russian newspaper Izvestia. And we have starts rather dramatically. It says that Kiev may succeed in recruiting up to 10 million fresh troops if the Ukrainian parliament passes the toughest version of the new mobilization law currently before lawmakers, which is inconceivable, by the way. I mean, 10 million men is, nobody I know in Ukraine is talking about that number. But anyway, but the article goes on to say, but it is very unlikely that such recruits will prove to be highly motivated soldiers. And the mobilization bill is still being debated within the Ukrainian parliament. It continues to be controversial. And there's reports about how the Ukrainian media is actively covering the question of the shortage of troops to replace fallen soldiers in the conflict zone. And the article in Izvestia goes on to say that the mobilization bill has no support amongst the civilian population, and a former Rada deputy, Vladimir Oleynik, who is clearly Ukrainian, but who I sense in this article appears to be perhaps more aligned with the Russians now. Perhaps he is even in Russia. Anyway, he's quoted by Izvestia saying, there is a dilemma. If the law is not passed, the military will be outraged. But if it is passed, there will be a public uproar. And then there is a quote from the Russian official, foreign ministry official, Rodion Miroshnik, who, again, it should be stressed, is a former official of the government of the Lugansk People's Republic. He has now been seconded to the Russian Foreign Ministry since Lugansk region became, in Russian law, a part of the Russian Federation. Anyway, he is now saying, and this is according to Izvestia, that total mobilization would be an enormous crime against the Ukrainian people because it's wiping out the gene pool, which has suddenly been transformed from the valuable core of the nation into a consumable to be chewed up by the Western war machine. So this is Miroshnik talking in perhaps rather more emotional terms. But anyway, he's making a point that's been made by others, including by Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama, which is that we've now reached that point where if Ukraine starts mobilizing further, it is going to weaken the already parlous demographic situation within the country. Miroshnik is making essentially the same point in rather more, shall we say, outspoken language. And then Olenik, this former Rada deputy, who, as I said, does seem to be aligned with Russia. Anyway, he is then quoted by Izvestia as saying that if a large percentage of Ukraine's already depleted population were to be sent to the combat zone, Ukraine would face imbalances in tax collection, whilst the already existing acute labour shortage, particularly in defence enterprises, would become an even bigger headache for Kiev. And then Izvestia throws in its own very sardonic comment. It says that, by and large, Ukrainian President Zelensky's attempts to find a source of warm bodies. I have to say, I find that expression somewhat distasteful, but there it is. That's what Izvestia says. To replenish the army increasingly looks like part of a cynical plan to prop up US President Biden's sagging favorability ratings ahead of the US presidential election. It is crucial for Biden to demonstrate that Ukraine at least has not yet been defeated. So the Russians don't expect this mobilization to change the situation on the battlefronts. They remain convinced that it will ultimately worsen Ukraine's overall situation. And they say that in the end, what is driving it is the need to prevent a Ukrainian collapse before the presidential election in the United States in November. Now, that may be a very cynical view. It is one I know that a lot of people share, but one should not overlook the Ukrainian dimension. It's not just President Biden who needs to keep the war going. As I've discussed already, it is to a certain extent President Zelensky as well, and of course other people in Ukraine and Western Europe who are also massively invested in this Ukrainian enterprise. So that's what's being said in Russia about the mobilization. Now, there are reports from Ukraine, and it is undoubtedly the case that this mobilization law has not yet been finalized. There are reports in Ukraine that the Ukrainian authorities have now shifted from a plan of recruiting, mobilizing 500,000 men in one go, and that the plan is to stretch out this 500,000 that General Zaluzhny is talking about over the course of the entirety of this year, and that would mean a mobilization plan of 35,000 a month. Now, that might be true, but it's important to stress that that would be only replacements for existing Ukrainian losses. And ABC has apparently done a report. It's a TV report. I haven't seen it. But anyway, I'm getting reports about it. And apparently a doctor at a hospital in Dnipro, the city the Russians refer to as Dnipropetrovsk, said that he receives between 40 and 100 heavily wounded soldiers, apparently on a daily basis, and that between 50 and 100 surgical operations are conducted by his hospital every day, and that the majority of surgeries are amputations. That seems astonishing claim, by the way, and given that amputations, the number of amputations is a way of calculating casualties, that gives us appalling numbers for Ukrainian casualties. But anyway, ABC then quotes doctors as saying that according to their information, around 30,000 Ukrainian troops are either killed or heavily wounded every month. So, 30,000 men killed or heavily wounded every month, 50 to 100 operations, surgical operations carried out, apparently in Dnipro. I find that astonishing. Maybe I misunderstood this. Maybe that's across the whole of Ukraine. But major surgical operations every day, 50 to 100, resulting in most cases in amputations. One can get a sense of the enormous losses that Ukraine is suffering. And if Ukraine's mobilization plan is now indeed reduced to enlisting 35,000 men a month, that simply replaces the losses that, according to ABC, or at least according to the doctors interviewed by ABC, Ukraine is suffering every month. In other words, the Ukrainian army would simply be standing still. It would not even replace the losses that the Ukrainian military suffered over the course of the summer offensive. Now, I say that. Dima at the Military Summary Channel says that the plan is to try and call up 150,000 men over the next 3 months, which does seem to be some kind of an attempt to make up the losses of the summer, and that the balance of the troops will be enlisted at the rate of 35,000 a month over the rest of the year. Maybe that is the plan. But one way or the other, it does seem to me as if Ukraine is struggling to mobilize soldiers and is in effect standing still in terms of replenishment. And Dima at the Summary Channel has made a further point that if this is indeed the mobilization plan, trying to keep numbers stable rather than actually to increase them, then one can forget about any Ukrainian offensives this year. There simply will not be enough men to carry out any offensives this year. The plans by President Zelensky that I was talking about over my last 2 programs, the ones that have been floated in the Western media, to launch some great amphibious assault across the Dnieper River into Kherson region once the F-16s appear on the scene. Someone apparently in Ukraine realizes the complete unreality of that plan, and the mobilization law has been recalibrated in effect to make that impossible. Now, I'm going to say something further. If this is the actual mobilization plan, 150,000 men, let's just take Dima's numbers, 150,000 men over the next 3 months, followed by 35,000 each month, then, as I said, the Ukrainian army would be in effect standing still. At best, it might keep up for most of this year with the total number of men it had assembled prior to the launch of the summer offensive. And that only, by the way, for most of this year, because it's difficult to imagine that further mobilizations on this scale could be conducted by Ukraine going forward. Now, that implies a Ukraine remaining on the defensive if Ukraine remains on the defensive, what is its plan for victory? Bear in mind that the Russian military is increasing in size every day at a rate of, well, if you believe Putin and Shoigu, a rate of around 1,500 men a day. I mean, how does Ukraine expect to win in that case? The Russians continue to increase their pressure all along the front lines. The Western powers probably exhausted the resources that they can send to Ukraine. There are probably less artillery shells that they can send, fewer tanks. There doesn't seem to be any enthusiasm, by the way, to send more tanks. They can send long-range missiles. I've discussed that in many programs. I've also explained why sending long-range missiles is not going to make any difference, and Brian Baletic has discussed that at great length. And as I will discuss shortly, there are now further pieces of information showing that the war in the air is going disastrously for Ukraine, and the F-16s are not going to change that. So, given growing Russian military power, growing Russian technological expertise, and the fact that at best Ukraine can only stand still with all of this mobilization, and it's important always to remember that the men who are being mobilized are not replacements in terms of skill and motivation to the men who have already been lost. We've seen what the Wall Street Journal and the sources in Germany have to say about that. Then what is Ukraine's plan for victory? How does it expect to prevail in this war? In a recent program that we did here with him, Glenn Deason and I, the Deputy Ambassador of Russia to the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky, compared Ukraine's plight today with that of Germany at the end of 1943, the beginning of 1944. And this would seem to be, if this mobilization plan is implemented about right, they can go on defending, perhaps, though with growing difficulty, and the Russians, of course, possibly able to advance further and faster than we expect today, but they might be able, with all these extra troops, to resist for longer, but it will become more difficult for them to do that all the time, and that is not a strategy for victory. Now, let me turn to the question of the war in the air, because again, I've received a lot of information. Again, this has been from private sources. I obviously have to qualify this by saying that I can't myself independently corroborate what this information is providing to me, though, well, I should correct that. In one case, to a great extent, I can do, but not in all of these cases. But let's just talk about the situation with the war in the air. I think it is now generally acknowledged. There's been more and more reports about this. Even the Western media is sort of tiptoeing around the admission that the 3 big missile strikes that Russia has launched on the 29th of December, the 3rd of January, and the 8th of January have done massive damage to Ukraine's air defense system, and have done huge amounts of damage to the Ukrainian military industrial complex. And there have been further reports which say that US, or rather total global production of Patriot missile interceptors is around 500 missiles a year, which is well in excess of Ukraine's usage of these interceptors. I mean, the Ukrainians are using Patriot missile interceptors at many times this level. So even putting aside the fact that the Russians seem to be increasingly successful destroying missile launchers and attacking warehouses where missiles are stored, because we don't know what proportion of those are Patriot missile launchers and Patriot missiles, but it's likely that quite a few have been. Well, it's not going to prove possible for the West to go on supplying Ukraine with Patriot missile launchers. And apparently Raytheon is talking about increasing production of Patriot missile interceptors by a further 100 by next year. But anyway, that is not going to be anywhere near enough to meet Ukrainian needs and the needs of the United States and its allies globally, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. So that's already a major problem. And I think this is now widely acknowledged. We've also now started to get more information about what has happened to the Ukrainian Air Force. Now, over the course of the autumn, I was commenting upon the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry was reporting catastrophically high fighter aircraft losses by Ukraine, that MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s were being shot down in what seemed to be extraordinarily high numbers. And we're now starting to get some corroboration that these Russian claims are at least partly true. And this corroboration is coming in the saddest form, with reports now from Ukraine confirming the death of fighter pilots, shot down as they were conducting air operations. I saw a particularly sad one, at least sad from my perspective, that one of these pilots was just 23 years old, which, by the way, seems to me extraordinarily young for a fighter pilot fighting a jet aircraft. And it does make me wonder whether some people aren't being rushed through their training courses and sent into the air with inadequate training, because Ukraine is now starting to run short of pilots as well as aircraft. There's also a report in, I believe it's Military Watch magazine, which says that Ukraine has now basically lost its inventory of Sukhoi 27 fighter jets. These were the best fighter jets that Ukraine inherited from the former Soviet Union. They were very advanced fighter jets, more advanced, more effective than the F-16s that the West is sending to Ukraine. I've read commentaries by Ukrainian pilots who have flown both Sukhoi 27s and F-16s, and they appear to agree that the Sukhoi 27s are far superior to the F-16s. So most of those aircraft, practically all of them in fact, have apparently been shot down. And because the Soviet Union restricted export of the Sukhoi 27, it was not supplied to the Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact allies. For example, the West is unable to replace them. They can't find Sukhoi 27s that they can send to Ukraine to make up losses. The Russians, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did export Sukhoi type aircraft to various countries, to India specifically. India apparently manufactures the Sukhoi 30, which is a very advanced version of this aircraft. So does China. But India and China are emphatically not going to transfer aircraft of this type to Ukraine. In fact, there is an investigation underway in India to find out how Indian manufactured ammunition, artillery ammunition, appears to have found its way to Ukraine, and the Modi government is unhappy about the fact that that apparently happened in some way. So no prospect of replacing the Sukhoi 27s, and some pilots at least killed, all of which appears to confirm the overall picture that Ukraine's fighter jet inventory was massively depleted by the Russians over the course of the autumn. Now, I've had further reports, one particular report to be precise, which confirms the integration of Israeli-produced ASAR radars into the Ukrainian air defense system to support the Patriots. And this report came with information from open sources which appeared to corroborate this to a certain degree. So I'm going to accept, I have largely accepted already that information. I think I'm now going to entirely accept it. But as we have seen, even with the use of these advanced, very expensive radars, the Patriot system can't shoot down anything more than a small fraction of the Kinjal missiles. Most of them get through. The Ukrainian claims that they're able to shoot down most or all of the Kinjals launched against Kiev have proved to be wrong. There are now multiple pictures of Kinjals hitting targets in and around Kiev. That claim has been demolished. So it seems overall that the situation in terms of air defenses for Ukraine is becoming bleak. Their air defense system is depleted. It is becoming brittle. There are insufficient numbers of Patriot missile interceptors to make up for the Patriot missiles that have been used or lost in Russian missile strikes. Many pilots, or at least some pilots, have been killed, and the best fighter jets have been lost, and the fighter jets that the West is supplying, the F-16s, are not going to be are not comparable in quality to the fighter jets that Ukraine has already lost. So again, a steady degrading in Ukrainian capabilities. All of this as we get reports that the Russians are ramping up fighter jet production with MiG-31s now regularly patrolling the Black Sea. There's been confirmation of this from various sources. The number of Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighters is increasing, and we know that they are participating in the special military operation in some form. And of course, the Sukhoi 35s, the very advanced fourth generation double plus version of the Sukhoi 27, are increasingly dominating the skies over Ukraine itself. So, steady weakening of Ukrainian defenses, steady ramp up in Russian drone production. And I spoke yesterday about how Shoigu is saying that Russia is intending to produce more heavy drones. And with the depletion of Ukrainian air defenses, it's likely that we're going to start to see, over the course of 2024, this year, more of these heavy drones in operation further behind Ukrainian battlefronts. And by the way, we're getting lots of reports about other weapons being used. The Russians apparently have a new precision-guided cluster bomb, which is apparently entering service. There's more advanced forms of suicide drone. These are tactical suicide drones, different from the Uranium 2s. More of these appearing on the scene. Some of these drones are intended to operate in drone swarms, functioning with AI technology, able to hover over the battlefield, pick up targets, and attack those targets without having direct input from operators, which will make them, by the way, more resilient to jamming. So all of that is going on. There are more reports that the Uranium 2 drone is being updated. There's a jet-powered version apparently shortly going to enter service. That's going to be quieter, more maneuverable, more difficult to defend against, and it has apparently a longer range. I'm not sure about that, but that's what I've seen some claim. We'll see. So all of these weapons increasingly appearing on the battlefronts. And while Ukraine is trying to use more drones, building more drones to try to make up for its artillery shortages, I spoke yesterday about how one Ukrainian minister has admitted that drones are not a complete substitute for artillery. And there are some reports now that because Ukraine is being forced increasingly to make drones by hand using less effective, less high quality subcomponents, as opposed, in contrast to the Russians, who produce drones, including FPV drones, industrially, that some of the Ukrainian drones are suffering from manufacturing and quality control problems. So, put this all together, and again, one asks the question, what is Ukraine's path for victory in this situation, or even for holding their positions over the course of 2024? If Zelensky's fantastic plan of an offensive in Kherson region, another advance towards Crimea, is unworkable, and there does seem to be a wide consensus that this is the case, even within Ukraine itself, and the mobilization plan, as apparently is going to be organized, has put the end to that particular idea. Then what exactly are the Ukrainians hoping for, Zelensky himself hoping for, that they feel is going to turn the tide? I just ask this question because we're getting a lot more information about what happened at the latest meeting that took place between the G7 states and the Global South states, which discussed the situation in Ukraine as part of this diplomatic process that was put together by Jake Sullivan. Now, there's a number of things I want to correct from my previous reports about this very sketchy, or rather secret meeting. First of all, it did not take place in Malta, as I believed. It actually took place in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. Secondly, it is now confirmed that Brazil and the United Arab Emirates stayed away. So Brazil and the UAE stayed away, as did China. Now, already that tells us that important countries are losing interest in this process. China is now becoming Russia's biggest trading partner by far. They've been skeptical about this whole diplomatic approach from the get-go, and they've now pulled out of it entirely. More importantly, so has Brazil. Now, Brazil has tried up to now to take a kind of equidistant position, or rather a more equidistant position to this conflict than China has. But Lula is still apparently angry about the fact that President Zelensky stood him up ahead of a meeting that was supposed to happen on the occasion of the last G7 summit meeting in Tokyo, which Lula was also invited to. And President Lula himself seems to have had enough of Zelensky and Ukraine and this crisis and Jake Sullivan's process. And Brazil, most important country, the biggest country by far in South America, appears to have pulled out of this whole process entirely. And I would have said that was a big blow. Now, other countries, the UAE we know about, but apparently a number of other countries also stayed away. And it seems that attendance at this meeting was significantly lower than it has been in previous meetings in this sequence. And worse for the West, those countries which were present, Saudi Arabia, which was the host, Turkey, which was, of course, also there, India too. The Indians always aim to remain in touch with the Americans, with the British, with the Western powers, even though they are members of the BRICS, and even though Prime Minister Modi and his government are clearly intent on deepening India's relationship with Russia, giving the relationship more of an economic dimension. Anyway, all three of these countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and India, and apparently some other global south countries, apparently all told the Ukrainians and the Western powers the same thing. They said, look, we have seen Zelensky's plan, which essentially asks for total capitulation. We hear what you say, that the outcome to this war should be the protection of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And of course, in principle, we support the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. We're not against that. But why, in the end, are you wasting our time by inviting us to these meetings? Surely what you need to do is not talk to us. You must talk to the Russians instead. You must begin direct talks with the Russians. And of course, that is exactly the message that both the Western powers and Ukraine don't want to hear. The Americans don't want to negotiate directly with the Russians, because firstly, doing so after all that's happened would be deeply humiliating. It would be an admission that the Ukrainian project is failing, and the Russians would be bound to open up the demand that any settlement of the Ukrainian crisis must involve a reconsideration of the entire security architecture in Europe. So the Americans don't want to talk to the Russians, and of course the Ukrainians don't want to talk to the Russians either. They've ruled it out, they've made it illegal, and they don't want to be told to negotiate with the Russians. So my understanding is that this entire Riyadh meeting went very badly, and there is some talk that this process is now on the brink of collapse. Apparently another meeting is due to happen in a few weeks' time, sometime in February, but one does wonder what purpose these meetings now are fulfilling. I'm going to just add one thing though. What the Saudis, the Turks, the Indians, all of these global south countries are telling the Western powers and the Ukrainians obviously makes sense. Ukraine doesn't have a path to victory. Its attempt to achieve victory last year with its summer offensive was a massive defeat. Ukrainian losses are enormously high. Everybody acknowledges this. The Wall Street Journal has just written about it. The Ukrainian mobilization plan is not going to result in any big increase in Ukrainian military power. At most, it will replace existing losses, except, of course, that it's likely that those losses are going to grow and that the replacements, the new troops that are going to be conscripted through this process, are not going to be motivated or skilled or trained to the level of the men that they're replacing. Besides, the mobilization, as the Russians are saying, and as is probably true, the mobilization is going to worsen Ukraine's already very bad demographic situation. And on the other side, we see the Russians getting stronger. Now, I've talked about their successes in aerial warfare, which are unlikely to be reversed. In fact, that trend is likely to intensify. I've talked about Russian pressure all along the front lines. I've now had more information about the artillery war. And it is very interesting and in some ways very ominous for Ukraine. Now, in my last discussion, when I was discussing again the Wall Street Journal's figures for Russian artillery use, I wondered whether perhaps it was an understatement, whether it was indeed the case that the Russians were only launching, as the Wall Street Journal says, 10,000 shells a day, firing 10,000 shells a day, given that previously they fired many more shells than this. And even though 10,000 shells a day is according to the Wall Street Journal, 5 times as many as the Ukrainians are firing. Well, I now again had information from an unimpeachable source who tells me that this is correct. And one of the reasons there are a number of reasons why the Russians are firing fewer shells. One of them is that many of the most difficult Ukrainian defense points have now been broken in Bakhmut, in Marinka, in other areas, so the Russians need to use fewer shells. Well, that may be true or not, but the main point is that the Russians are stockpiling. And this report spoke about the Russians having stockpiled a huge number of shells, around a million shells in one specific location. And again, I'm not going to reveal where it is because I don't want to compromise this particular source. To repeat, they've not stockpiled just 1 million shells. They've stockpiled 1 million shells in one location to support a potential advance in one direction. And they're ramping up production of artillery. As I've discussed already, there seems to have been a surge in Russian shell production in the last couple of weeks, which is sustained as new production facilities are coming online. And one way or the other, at some point, the Russians will have many, many, many more shells than they have at the present time, and many, many more shells to use. And this particular source also made the point that the Russians don't want to go on firing shells in vast quantities, given the effect of barrel wear. They want to conserve the number of their artillery pieces, the condition of their artillery pieces, for the time when they will indeed be firing many more shells than they are currently. Now, if the Russians are indeed stockpiling shells in these numbers, then that also, to my mind, points to preparations by the Russians for a big offensive sometime over the course of this year. Again, I'm not going to try to guess where. What I would say about this is that there's just been another article by Robert Clark, I believe, or Ross Clark, in the Daily Telegraph. He makes many points in that article, which again I find difficult to understand or accept. He comes up once more with this claim that the Russians are devoting 30% of their GDP to military production. A fantastic figure, which has no basis in reality. But he says that the European Union has so far only managed to deliver 300,000 shells out of the 1 million it promised last March, and there doesn't seem to be any prospect of increasing production rates to fulfill more Ukrainian orders, more Ukrainian needs anytime soon. And to come to a topic that I've touched on this channel and which we have explored in more detail on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, if there is going to be a major expansion of fighting in the Middle East over the next few weeks and months, then of course the number of shells available to supply to Ukraine from the already depleted American supply chain is going to fall further, and probably that will also be the case with air defense systems as well. So, coming back to that point, the global south countries, the Indians, Saudis, Turks, they are surely right. The important thing, if this situation is to be retrieved in some form, and if Ukrainian lives and some Russian lives are to be spared, is to face the realities of the situation and to talk to the Russians. Now, the terms the Russians will impose will be eye-wateringly harsh. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. But they would be better than an outcome in which Ukraine is comprehensively defeated and completely capitulates. Which is the choice now? The West has had repeated opportunities to find a diplomatic exit to this whole crisis. Opportunities going all the way back to February 2014. It's passed up every single one. In every case, by doing so, the West and Ukraine have been cumulatively making their situation, their position, worse, and it is the Ukrainian people who have been overwhelmingly paying the price. By now, that ought to be obvious, and it is going to continue to get worse still. And yet, despite that, and despite this wise advice from the global south countries, that continues to be this complete unwillingness to consider negotiations. Well, perhaps something might happen that will break this impasse. In a recent program that my colleague Alex Christoforou and I did on the Duran, we touched on a recent meeting between President Biden and his predecessor, President Obama. Apparently, Obama came along and the two men had dinner together, and apparently Obama gave President Biden some advice. And I pointed out in the program that we made, Alex Christoforou and I, that Obama at least has at times did show as president, some awareness of the limits of American power. He warned, for example, in an interview that he gave to The Atlantic in 2016, that in Ukraine, the Russians will always have escalatory dominance, and so, of course, it is turning out. One would love to know what exactly was the advice that President Obama no doubt gave to President Biden. If it is to begin talks with the Russians, I suspect in President Biden's case, that would be deeply unwelcome advice. But perhaps President Biden is not going to be there for much longer. There's been increasing numbers of comments, increasing comments from all sorts of sources suggesting that the time has come for President Biden to quit the scene. There's reports that he might be intending to quit the scene, or that there's pressure on him to quit the scene sometime around the start of the primary season. That is leaving it dangerously late, as far as I can tell. And perhaps the clearest sign that patience with the president is starting to run out comes on the cover of The Economist magazine. Globalist neocon magazine par excellence, or one widely read by the Anglo-American establishment and their fellow travelers around the world. And the cover basically shows a clapped up 1940s car and suggests it's time for this car to be scrapped. And it's not difficult to work out that it is in fact President Biden that is being referenced here. Well, I would not put it in quite such terms. I find that's a rather brutal message. But there it is. If President Biden cannot steer the United States out of the various crises that are accumulating in Ukraine, in the Middle East, given that his polling numbers are bad, given that his rival, President Trump, is now consistently outpolling him, I can personally well understand why there are increasing demands that he should go. Whether he will follow that advice, whether the team around him will listen, who's to say? But perhaps if he does decide to go, even if he remains president until January of next year, even if he refuses to step aside and let Kamala Harris do his job, well, that might finally open up some way diplomatically to move forward with this crisis in Ukraine and perhaps with the crisis in the Middle East also. We shall see. But whatever happens, this present situation of policy standstill, both with respect to Ukraine and, by the way, the Middle East as well, is becoming increasingly dangerous and is creating more and more risks for the United States and its allies in the future. Perhaps, just possibly, some people, maybe Barack Obama being one, can see that, but it remains to be seen what, if anything, they can do. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that we will, we are on various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You could support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. We have a discount sale, 15% on t-shirts, by the way, but you can find all sorts of other great things there as well. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, all of those amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.